Today I'm going to talk about how and why to use Flexbox. Before I start, how many people do web development in their day-to-day or just weekly kind of basis here? All right, excellent. So looks like half, 60%, something like that. Good. How many people would describe themselves as beginners in web development? Okay. Moderate? Expert? I got quite a mix. This will be interesting. All right. I should have something for everybody here. If you're a beginner, some things may go over your head. I'll attempt to ground everything real simply, but just absorb what you can out of this. It's okay if you don't get everything for now. The specification that I edit is fairly easy to read, and there's a lot of tutorials coming out as we go along. So just getting a sense of what sort of things you can do with Flexbox is still a useful benefit from this talk, even if you don't get every single detail. If you're an expert user, this talk will go through a lot of real-world scenarios. Even if you already grasp some of the basic uses of Flexbox, you probably don't realize what all kinds of things can be done with it. And hopefully this will expand your mind a little bit and show some really nice avenues for experimentation in the future. So we're going to start looking at a little bit of history. This was the original Flexbox specification, published back in, let's see, July 2009. That was the last time it was touched. So it's a good 4 years old now. Flexbox, the original spec, was based on XUL, or XUL. It's the technology used to produce Firefox's UI. It's an XML-based language, very similar to HTML, that had a couple of layout primitives added in that made it easier to use than straight HTML for designing interfaces. This was very, very useful as they determined for extensions and whatnot, so it was thought, hey, that'd probably be useful for web pages as well. And they translated all the basic XUL Flex stuff over into a CSS spec that you're seeing right here. The problem with this was the spec was always a little bit vague in a lot of details. The layout algorithm was a little slow. There was an unavoidable n-squared term in there, and we try to avoid those in core layout algorithms. And because of the lack of details in some areas, the two implementations that arrived, one in WebKit, that's the engine that drives Chrome and Safari, and Firefox, always had fairly divergent details. Even fairly basic things often worked slightly differently between the two, and sometimes wildly differently. So it was difficult to use this spec even when they'd been in the browser for some time. So to help that, a few years ago, I started working on Flexbox myself. I thought it was a really interesting technology, and I had just been learning web development, just been teaching myself web dev, and I really wanted to use this, but it wasn't very good. So I started working on the new specification here. It looks very similar. I guess the layout's a little different, but that's unimportant. But we're going to go through some of the details today of what Flexbox is, how it works, why it's different and better than the old specification. In particular, just over general cases, the spec here separated out a few concerns a little bit better, made a slightly better factoring of the abilities. It tightened down the algorithm very well. There's a dedicated layout section that doesn't show up in most types of specs. That just lays out in a very algorithmic manner how you have to do Flexbox. And generally made it a little bit faster, a little bit more efficient, and added a few new abilities. If you would like to read this specification, the easiest way to do it is by looking either at this version or the editor's draft link. dev.w3.org/csSwg/css3-flexbox. Actually, you can leave off the 3. It just goes to whatever the latest version is. The latest stable version, which right now should be roughly equivalent, is at the normal w3.org URL for stable drafts. This spec at the moment, even though this version is listed as editor's draft because I have made a few changes since the last publication, this specification is in candidate rec, which is a particular stage in the spec lifetime in the W3C. This means that it's stable, browsers are implementing it, tests are being written for it, and there shouldn't be major changes from here on out. It is on its way to becoming a full recommendation, and I expect Flexbox to become a recommendation within the next year or two as we have time to focus on testing. By the way, if you are following along with my own slides and you happen to click on something in here and the left and right no longer work, click on either the, either the title or the little page indicator down here to get you back into the slide scope so that the key presses will be picked up properly. So Flexbox is a new layout algorithm. Let's back up a little bit. Everybody here who has tried to put together a modern web page using today's layout systems, raise your hand. I'm very, very sorry. Deeply apologize from my heart that we put you through all that crap. CSS was designed for documents. That was put out in the beginning. And it took a long, long time to evolve past that. Back when it was created about 20 years ago, we didn't think HTML was going to be an application language. It was meant for documents, slightly more structured than plain text, and we assumed that Java or something would handle the application case on the web. Obviously, it's gone way past that. HTML spreaded lots of new features. JavaScript grew enormously in speed and ability. Just in the past 5 years, JavaScript has 100 times improvement in speed. That's way past Moore's Law. It is mainly just from us caring about it and a bunch of recent improvements in dynamic language performance. So because of that, CSS's layout abilities, the ability to put things around on the page somehow, determine their size and position, has always lagged quite a bit. And web developers, like I was before I moved to Google, and like many of y'all are, have paid the price for this in coming up with ridiculous hacks to achieve the most basic things. We're talking about using floats to have a 2-column layout, using inline block or display table to lay things out horizontally. There's all sorts of weird little tricks we've been able to come up with over time, all of which have their strengths and a lot of weaknesses. And they're all different. So that you have to memorize 3 or 4 completely different ways to do approximately the same thing, just in case the particular use you want to put it to falls afoul of one of the weaknesses of your favorite method. That's ridiculous. So Flexbox fixes a lot of this. The rest of it will be mostly fixed by grid layout, which I'll touch on a little bit at the end of this talk. These two specs together will solve nearly all of our basic layout-related woes in CSS and make it much easier to develop web pages and components in web pages without a ton of specialized knowledge. So Flexbox is made of 4 basic parts, as listed here. First is direction. Current CSS layout is very much biased toward a top-to-bottom direction. Blocks always flow downwards. You can make them flow sideways using flow, inline block, etc., but that's a completely different layout mode with new rules, new interactions between things. Flexbox doesn't care about your direction. You can point it top to bottom, left to right, right to left, even bottom to top, and it all works the same way no matter which way you're pointing. This is a massive simplification for a lot of common scenarios. Secondly is alignment. Who here has ever pulled their hair out trying to vertically center something in CSS? Everyone, yeah. Flexbox, it's one property. It's super simple. It's ridiculous that we made you do it that long. Alignment lets you, for one thing, center things. You can put things at the start or the end of a Flexbox. You can distribute them evenly. I'll have a couple of examples showing some of the power of Flexbox's alignment primitives. The third is ordering. One common thing that I used back in the day when I was writing web pages was the Holy Grail layout that let me put my main web page content first in the markup with my sidebars after it, but then display them in whatever order I wanted. This was better for screen readers and search engines and related things like that. But it was always very fragile, very hacky, very complicated. Flexbox makes it trivial to put your source in whatever order is best for you and then reorder it arbitrarily within the document. And finally, the thing that gives it its name, flexibility. Flexbox lets you tell an element to take up whatever space is left over in some place. That's really hard to do right now. You can hack it sometimes by using a block element with overflow hidden or something and putting it next to a float. It'll shrink a little bit so that it doesn't overlay the float. But that only works in a couple of cases, and in general it's very difficult to have several things next to each other exactly filling up the space that they have. You usually have to use JavaScript. Flexbox makes this completely trivial to do and offers a lot of power in how you do it. So the first example here is a basic navigation bar. As you see right now, it's given some basic styling. This is just a UL with some LIs in it. Nothing fancy going on here. Just some styling to let you see the boxes a little bit better. Because LIs are blocked by default, that's why this goes down. If you wanted to make it sideways, you'd have to float the LIs or make the whole thing display table or something like that. So a quick diversion here for the alignment spec. I've been showing you a lot of stuff in Flexbox that does alignment. But all of these abilities, the Flexbox abilities and a few more properties, are generalized now to all the layout modes. This hasn't been implemented yet. This is still an early spec, but should be here in the next year or two, where you can use things like align content center to vertically align a block or a table cell or anything else. You don't have to memorize all these crazy new things. All told, you get 6 alignment properties, forming a nice little 2x3 matrix. 3 of them starting with justify for whatever the main direction is, and 3 of them starting with align going the other way. Then content controls the stuff inside, the alignment of all of its children. That's what was space around and space between and whatnot in the Flexbox. Self is put on the child, controls its alignment within the parent. Flexbox doesn't use justify self because it already has the whole parent control, but it does use align self. That's what was used to do the vertical alignment in my examples. And then the items is a little shortcut. Set that on the parent, and the children, unless you override them, will automatically pick up that value as their self. I was actually using align items for everything so that I didn't have to worry about setting on individual ones. So this is an interesting spec to think about for now. Wait in a year or two until you start seeing tutorials come out before you try to use it. For now, just go ahead and use Flexbox for all your alignment needs, for all your vertical centering or horizontal centering needs. So next example is something that I ran into a long time ago, and I've run into cases like this all the time. I have here a largish page. This is actually a little web app that I and my wife use to plan our meals for the week. So it goes down quite a bit. There's a ton of things going on here. And this in particular is supposed to take a recipe, keep them there, and though the buttons are removed from this simple example, lets you generate grocery lists from it and whatnot. So this works just fine if they're in view. But if you go down a little bit and the table's out of view, I'm going to put this over in there. I can't. It doesn't scroll up. Nothing there. What I really want is to keep the table at least, and possibly the heading, on screen at all times, and just make the list of recipes scroll. Really difficult to do in general in today's HTML. There's no way to say, take up whatever space is left over and then scroll within there. You generally would have to use JavaScript or guess with percentage and whatnot. Flexbox, it's trivial. So I have a very simple skeleton of a page here. It has the 5 basic items that you'll probably see in every page. Right now they're just laid out as divs, but as blocks. But of course I turn on some Flexbox and I get a basic page layout. So pay attention to the structure here. I have header, a div, and then a footer at this level, at the top level. And I have to put the middle contents inside of the div container. This is required for Flexbox. I'll get into a moment why grid makes this a little bit better. But for now, deal with this. So if we look down in the CSS again, the body element is once again a Flexbox, and it's a column Flexbox. So the header, the central content, and the footer go vertically. Similarly, the div becomes a Flexbox, by default horizontal, and that lays out the 3 central items. Notice that it has its own flex set to 1, so that vertically it takes up the leftover space. And then inside of here, the article has its flex set to 1, so within the div, it takes up all the space and pushes the rest over to the side. I then used order to put the nav on one side rather than the other. I could go more into detail, putting more orders to be very explicit. This is enough for now. And obviously you can arbitrarily rearrange this as well. You have navigation on the left or the right, just change the order, no problem whatsoever. So Flexbox is really easy to use for basic page layouts here. If I was going to do this right now without Flexbox, I'd go look up the Holy Grail layout, which is an incredibly clever but incredibly disgusting hack around floats. It's also quite a bit fragile. If you've ever had to rely on float-based layouts before, they tend to fail as soon as something too wide gets put into your layout. One image is just a little bit too big, an unbreakable word that's too long, and suddenly your entire layout goes to hell, and things are flowing underneath each other, everything's broken, you can't do anything about it. Flexbox is extremely robust in these circumstances. Something gets too big, too bad, you're not going to get a sudden rearrangement. One thing might overflow a bit, that's it, nothing fancy. While Flexbox was great for that very simple page layout, it's not good for more complex layouts. Anything with a complex two-dimensional layout is going to involve a lot of Flexboxes nested in really ugly ways that will remind you of table layout, and that's not a good thing. As a simple example, here's a moderately complicated but not too bad web page, built from an actual page I saw with some university site. I forgot it, I've lost it by now, but there's a logo, a header, nav, etc., etc. This is not too bad of a web page. But if we look, it requires 6 Flexboxes nested inside of themselves to achieve this basic layout. The first one is a vertical, setting up in 2 pieces. The second splits the header up and splits the header up again. The fourth splits the body up into 2, the body up into 2, and finally the body up into the final 2. That's crazy. If we look at the actual markup of this, it's huge. Look at how far over that gets. That is a bad sign in markup if you have to go that far over, especially for useless elements that are only there for markup. What's worse, if you do a very tiny change to the markup, or to the structure, you might not even see the difference here. Let's point to anyone who can tell me what's different. Got it?
When it goes all the way across.
There you go. Yes. So one tiny change, that one corner is the only thing that moved. And suddenly, though, we have a fairly drastic rearranging of the structure. We go from 6 Flexboxes to 4, and everything's put into different parents. The first one is now a 3-element Flexbox, and we still have the 2 to split up the header, and then a single Flexbox in the central content to split that one up. If we look at the markup, this also looks quite a bit different. A fairly substantial rearranging of the document for a tiny change in layout that is not conducive to good structure and happy coders. That's something that can just come out of advertising, just saying we should put an extra image in the footer so it needs to be a little bit wider, and suddenly you have to do a lot of work to do a fairly minor change. This is where grid layout comes in. So we'll take the basic structure I just put, add a few more grid lines, so you see that this is divided up into a 3x4 grid. Obviously that's why I had the words duplicated up before. Here's the HTML that you need for it. None. There's no HTML at all. Just a little bit of CSS. All I'd say is that the body becomes a grid, display grid. I set up a template. This is more or less drawing your page layout in ASCII art. It sounds kind of silly when you first hear it, but it's really, really nice when you get to know it. There's also a more explicit form that's better for manipulation in JavaScript, but for humans, this is going to be the preferred syntax. It's really easy and really fun. You basically just, like I said, draw it out in ASCII art. This is exactly the same as the diagram you were just looking at, just rendered in text instead. And you tell elements to just go sit in one of the areas. The logo goes in the logo area, covering the 2 cells in the top. The header goes in the header area, etc. Nothing fancy going on here. Very simple and very easy to use. In general, these 2 display types, grid and Flexbox, work together really, really well. Flexbox is great for one-dimensional layouts, anything going from one side to the other, possibly wrapping into multiple lines. Grid is great for 2-dimensional layouts, anything with complex relationships spatially going on there. The 2 of them together, in general, grid will be used for your page layout, and Flexbox will be used for widget layouts, components inside your page. You can, of course, reverse this or nest grid inside grid, Flexbox inside Flexbox, etc. It all works really well together. They compose pretty much perfectly. And, of course, they work well with the existing layout models. We've seen the whole time everything bottoms out in a block layout or something like that, usually. So that's the basic end of my talk here. I'm going to have a Q&A session. You can ask me about anything that I've talked about today, anything Flexbox or grid related, or I'm really well versed on the web platform as a whole, so anything about CSS, JavaScript, HTML, the standards process, anything that comes to mind, go ahead and shout it out, and I will probably be able to answer it. So, anyone have questions?
Yeah. Thank you for the talk. I have a question. So when we use Flex layout for dynamic content arrangement, in a scenario where the user may start with a single piece of canvas, and then drop content into it, and then in that case you actually need, depending on user need, you actually need dynamically layout the content. Yeah. So it's possible in Flex.
Yeah, you saw one of my examples was of a chat room done with Flexbox. I was adding more elements just by reloading the page with new code, but if you drop JavaScript in there and just add things that way, layout still works perfectly fine. Everything gets relayed out appropriately. If you have Flex, that gets recalculated so that they take up the amount of space, or the right amount of space again, etc. There's nothing special about dynamic content here. Basically just, it lays out at one state, it lays out at a new state, nice and happy.
Both the horizontal direction and the vertical direction.
Yeah, Flexbox does not care which direction it's being laid out in. It all works symmetrically.
Yeah, I have another question if I ask.
Go for it.
Is there any performance overhead using Flexbox?
Surprisingly little, particularly when compared with the existing models of doing it. For example, anything you might have used table layout for in the past, or actually used table elements, the layout algorithm for tables is fundamentally n squared. We have a lot of nice speed-ups for a lot of common cases, but still any large document that uses tables, particularly if you get a lot of stuff like 10,000, a million rows, is going to be dog slow. Flexbox is much faster there. We have the core loop is, I think, just an n log n. It's very much faster there. And even for simple cases, tends to outperform the existing layout models like block and whatnot. It's much faster than I anticipated it to be. I thought it was just going to be really convenient and kind of okay in performance, but it's going pretty good all over the place.
Thank you.
Yes. The question was, how well does Flexbox play cross-browser and IE, etc.? So, as you saw, I was doing this presentation in Chrome. I could have done it in Safari or Firefox. They all support it in their current versions. And because they update regularly, everybody should have that. There's almost nobody on old Chromes, for example. IE is a slightly more complicated story, as usual. Flexbox is in IE 10, however, with an older syntax. Like literally the month after they did a code freeze, I changed almost all the names. So that's all done now. Names are stable at this point, but that was too late.
Which was the cause? Which was the effect?
Unrelated, unfortunately. I was trying to get the name changes in before their code freeze, but we couldn't decide on them. So just like, whatever, make them all now. So all the same functionality is there. I've only done tiny tweaks to the algorithm since then, so it should work basically the same. You just have to learn the different names for IE and use a different set of properties for it. IE 11 will have it. It may even be updated in IE 10. They're starting to push out browser updates as security updates. So that might work out well in the near future. If you're trying to do older IE, though, there's where you're going to run into some problems. Luckily, there's some interesting tricks you can use with Flexbox. I purposely specified Flexbox so that the children of a Flex container ignore any float or display set on them. Like if you set display inline block, they'll just be treated like display block. I don't care. This lets you write gracefully degrading code that uses float or uses inline block to achieve horizontal layouts, for example, and still have it work properly with Flexbox when that comes out. So you can go ahead and set a few simple properties on. It probably won't be pretty. You can work on it, but I suspect that there'll be some mismatches in the other properties you need. But you can just set everything to display inline block if you want a horizontal nav bar. That'll work in old IE, IE 9, IE 8, back to IE 7. And the new browsers will get proper Flexbox and ignore the IE compatibility stuff. So that works out pretty well too. There's another spec called the conditional rules module that adds an @supports rule. It's very similar to media queries, but instead of querying aspects of the device or the environment, it lets you query for support of particular properties. You can say @supports display flex, and then it'll only run the code inside of there if Flexbox is supported, if the browser understands display flex. This has support now. The @supports rule is supported in current Chrome and Firefox, and by current I'm meaning at least beta channels. I don't know if it's made it all the way to stable yet, but it will percolate over the next few weeks, the next month or two, and they'll show up in stable Firefox and stable Chrome. It may or may not be in Safari 7, I don't know. That one also has some nice examples. If you look up the spec, search for CSS conditional rules or something, it has some good examples of how to use @supports rule in a way that works well with backwards degradation, where you use your old code first and then put the supports rule, reverse everything you've done, and use your new stuff in. That way old browsers just ignore the whole block and use the beginning stuff. New browsers overwrite everything and use the new stuff. It works really well. Yes, ma'am?
What about cross-device?
So that's basically a subset of cross-browser, but I haven't talked about mobile, so it's a very good question. Thank you. Mobile sucks. Simple as that. We have a little bit of nice benefit. Any Firefox OS devices, teeny tiny fraction, nobody really cares about them yet. Firefox OS devices are more or less modern Firefox. Newer Chrome phones or newer Android phones and tablets come with or are easy to install Chrome on instead of the Android browser. That's also modern Chrome. It might be a version behind, I forget. It's not quite in sync with us, but it has all the same functionalities that desktop Chrome does. However, if you have to target older Android devices, and those are still a reality, a lot of things running Honeycomb and previous, you're in for a bad time. They don't really run Chrome, they just run Android browser, and that was frozen back at, I think, Chrome 16, We're at Chrome 27 now. So that was like over a year ago. These things do not work there. More or less treat it like an IE in terms of compatibility. You're going to have to lay out something else to support those types of devices.
What about Safari and iPhones?
Safari 7 has Flexbox in it. You might not know, Safari and Chrome recently diverged. We were previously both using WebKit as our rendering engine. A month or two ago, we finally decided to make a split for it, and we forked the code base. Safari still uses WebKit. Chrome now uses Blink. They were previously the same code. Now they're just diverging a little bit. Luckily, nearly all of the Flexbox work was done before the divergence, so everything that we've shown up here works perfectly fine in Safari 7. Yo.
This is perhaps related to the mobile question. Our talk 2 months ago was on responsive design.
Mm-hmm.
Any comments on Flexbox
Yeah.
and responsive design?
Flexbox is best friends with responsive design. There's a whole lot of things in responsive design where you want to have things be like as wide as you can get, as wide as is allowed on there. Flexbox obviously works great with that. There's a lot of demonstrations up here. You can have an image that very easily resizes to the available space, grows or shrinks. A lot of the techniques, the basic techniques you learned today with responsive layout, can be duplicated in Flexbox, often easier and with less code weight, easier to understand. So in general, Flexbox and responsive layout are really great together. Some specific additional benefits of this, responsive layout. So a lot of the basic techniques are just adjusting to slightly different widths. You have something that might work on a 600 pixel device or a 1200 pixel wide device. But if you want to do more imaginative rearrangings, which you often want to do when going from a wide desktop to a narrow mobile device, you want to fairly substantially rearrange things on the DOM. Flexbox with the order property lets you do a whole lot of this yourself. I even have an example of it in the spec of how to change a basic web page layout, like the little 5-block layout I had before, change it from the wide desktop thing with 3 columns to a fully vertical layout that works better for mobile, where you just have everything laid out one by one instead of trying to squeeze into the space there. Grid works even better for that. Grid is unimaginably great for putting different layouts together, just controlled by a media query, so that you can have substantially different layouts specialized for particular sizes of devices and present a much better view for your user at any one time without having to do any JavaScript or anything hard. It's very nice. Yo.
What if you need to animate to slide something out on the grid view?
That's a hard one right now. I'm trying to address this myself. The basic issue is, at least in like modern CSS, there's no way to express something that's kind of laid out in Flexbox or kind of laid out in Grid. You can do it by laying something out in Grid and then using transforms to animate it out of the screen or something, and then having script come in afterwards and clean up. But in general, it's very difficult to make this work well. I really, really want to, and I've been working on this technology on the spec side and a little bit on the implementation side. I want to find a way to describe transitions between 2 fairly different layouts. You can have a grid with some items and a grid with different items in different positions and have them smoothly flow between each other. So if one item shows up in both but in different positions, it just flies across the screen to its new spot. Cannot be done today. You have to more or less like look at where everything is on the DOM, rip out all the content you have and put it into absolute positioning or something, move it, and then rip it all back out, put it back into a grid. But that's something that should start coming out later this year in specs, and I expect it to show up in like real implementations 2015 or so probably. It's a little bit down the line, but it's something I'm actively thinking about right now and working with some of my colleagues in the Sydney office in Australia to get into actual browsers. It should be really interesting once those come out.
I have a compatibility question.
Mm-hmm.
If we try to use it today, so definitely I think I need to write a testing script to see if the browser is supporting Flex and which version of Flex need to be supported to have those functionality, right? So is that easy to accomplish, like to test the module, I mean in mobile browser and the desktop browser?
Yeah, it's a very easy to use script to test which version of Flexbox, if any, are supported. Modernizer already does this. If you've never looked at the Modernizer library, very simple to use. You just include a little script tag. It puts some classes on the body based on what things work and what things don't. And it tests for Flexbox right now. because it's really quite trivial. You just look for, you set like a display property on some div that's floating off on the side of the screen, see if it gives back the same value when you read it back out. And that tells you whether or not it's supported. Very easy to work with.
And the second question I have is, how does the compatibility for the modern framework, like jQuery, mobile, those frameworks, have you done any testing?
So a lot of the existing CSS frameworks, like Bootstrap or the jQuery mobile things and whatnot, haven't taken advantage of modern Flexbox, at least yet, because of the compatibility with IE. They value older IE compatibility pretty well. But I suspect in the next year or two, as IE continues, as old IEs continue their slide into irrelevance, and it becomes just more reasonable to depend on this in general, they will start, the existing frameworks and new ones will start using Flexbox heavily for their grid layouts, etc. I think you were next, yeah.
How hard would it be to implement all of this stuff in JavaScript? I mean, at least for the last 10 years, I do these exact same things in JavaScript.
Yeah.
And now that the JavaScript's 100 times faster, before it was fast, and now it seems infinitely fast to me. So to me, it's like, what's the purpose of putting all this huge CSS and standards when a small library of JavaScript can accomplish the same thing?
That's a perennial question. What stuff belongs in a library and what stuff belongs in the platform? And it doesn't have an easy answer, but generally we try to weigh developer hours versus web author hours. And if there's a huge difference, which there is in something like Flexbox, that tends to weight the calculus toward including it. Another big thing is, it only takes a second, half a second to download a library, but that's multiplied over, millions, billions of page views. And it's a lot of time wasted. If we can just build it into the browser once, that tends to be a win. But as to your earlier part of your question, emulating this in JavaScript, not too difficult, hard to get precisely right. A lot of the simple cases can be, as you are surely aware, done really easily in JavaScript. But there's a lot of complicated aspects where it interacts with CSS layout in hard ways, where you have to do things like make an off-screen element, fill it with your content, see how big it is, and then use that as an input. Those tend to be a little slow, a little janky. They can have some weird effects. We have some very smart people on the Google apps, for example, that have to do this all the time. Google Docs and Google Spreadsheet and whatnot basically are built on this. Put something off screen, measure it, and then size their actual stuff in JavaScript. It's very possible. It's not overly difficult to get most of the way. It's really difficult to get the entire way. And while it would probably be a good idea if you want to use something right now, like today, if you wanted to use grid, go ahead and use a JavaScript replacement instead. But in the near future, that shouldn't be necessary. And it's really, I think this is the kind of thing that's really valuable to go ahead and ship down natively to every author. You follow?
Well, I'm with the Douglas Crockford school that thinks that spreadsheets or CSS was a bad mistake. So
yeah, we have other people in our working group that feel the same way.
yeah, so
they're wrong.
That side. Sorry,
it's
about
easy.
That.
Web community's developer side seems to believe that nobody owns machines older than 10 years.
That's because it's mostly true. So the question is
like Power PCs, for instance.
Yeah. So the spec authors and developers and whatnot have an attachment, a fixation on the new. Newer machines are assumed to be always true. I'm really glad that it's true that machines tend to die fairly quickly, and you only have them for 10 years or so, because that's the only reason that IE6 is actually dying now. In a lot of cases, you have to have these things replaced. But it's just a reality. We're constantly growing new devices. Markets keep expanding, especially in mobile. We keep getting more people with phones, and they're buying modern phones. Machines die fairly quickly. Phones only have a lifetime of 3 to 4 years usually. Modern laptops, my laptop's running like 8 years or so now, but it's starting to show its age. It'll run out eventually. Even desktops, you start needing new hardware after a little while. And this is nice because every time you replace a computer, you automatically almost re-up into the newest operating system, the newest browser. If you were putting off updates, they just kind of happen without you trying extra hard. And that's kind of necessary for progress here. Otherwise, we'd be stuck with a lot of much older technology and be much slower to advance the state of the art. But do you have a more specific goal with that question?
No, you're doing the progress is our most important part. And as opposed to people have budgets, they don't want to go buy equipment necessarily.
Yeah.
And I'm wearing a 2006 phone, and we have a 2006 desktop and a 13-year-old PC that's still just fine. They still work. You can do development on them.
You can use that phone as a phone. Yeah, 7 years old.
I can use it as a spreadsheet.
Oh, nice. All right.
For this, HP.
Very nice. All right. Well,
the flip side of what you just said is that a lot of history is getting lost.
Very true.
You no longer see what it looked like.
So this is one of the really great things about the web, though, and what I was trying to get into just a second ago, but didn't address it well. The web is generally designed with a very heavy backwards compatibility story. Sure, the devices people use get replaced and whatnot. We assume that they're going to churn, but the code doesn't change. People still write the old code that was written 10, 15 years ago. That's almost still out there, unmaintained, and we want to be able to view it now. HTML has a frankly incredible legacy of backwards compatibility in that you can go view the very first web page that Tim Berners-Lee created. It still displays just fine today. And it's true in general. GeoCities, 15 to 20 years old, if you look at any of the old archives, still work almost exactly correct. In many cases, exactly right, because we've been forced to standardize and define the old stuff. Even if we tell everybody, don't use this old stuff, we still say to browsers, this is how you treat it when you encounter it. So the web in general is always going to have a very strong look backwards, even if it has an attachment to the new. Browser's side is always going to look at the old and make sure that it works well. We have too many pages to break. There's a trillion things on the web. Like last survey that I saw out of Google, over 1 trillion pages, and that's ridiculous. We can't break all of those. We owe it to ourselves, to history and future historians, to make sure that they know how to render our old documents. Related to that then, because we have such a strong backwards compatibility story we have to maintain, CSS in general and HTML and the other technologies often have a very strong fallback story themselves. As I was explaining in question to her, I believe, you can use some older properties to approximate Flexbox layout even while you're using Flexbox layout for the newer ones. And layout in particular is very bad for progressive enhancement. It doesn't tend to fall back nicely, but most of CSS does. If a browser doesn't understand a new property, it just ignores it, and the page still displays, it still works. And this works most of the time. And we have a really strong focus on making sure it keeps happening. We keep supporting old stuff. We keep introducing good progression stories, good upgrade stories to people so that old stuff still works. We don't shut out old devices that are still in the market, etc. So even though it's not perfect, I think the web as a whole has a much better legacy, both for old content and old devices, than most other parts of the technology stack. That's my opinionated rant here. Yes, sir.
How support email clients? Like,
oh God, so terrible.
Yeah.
So his question was how supporting email clients. Those are the worst. I hate email. Oh crap. If you have to design an email today, you still are best served by doing table layout and spacer GIFs. It's disgusting. I had to learn how to use spacer GIFs in like 2008 just so I could develop an email. So if you have to do email marketing, don't worry about anything. Forget the last 10 years. It didn't happen. These things just don't exist. Just use the oldest, nastiest layout text you could. Nested tables, whatever, gets you out there. Any other questions? Yes. So a whole lot of this stuff is very old ideas. Like Flexbox was from my Flexbox spec came from the older Flexbox spec, which came from XUL, which came from Motif actually, if I'm remembering correctly. I was just talking with one of the old Motif developers last week. The idea of flexing came from the very first web browsers. It was there in their interfaces back then. Same thing with grid layout, which I showed off. This comes from the modern grid layout spec is an evolution of an older template layout spec produced by Bert Bolst, one of the inventors of CSS, a good 15 years ago or so. These are not new ideas. We are just cannibalizing the past, but finally making them work on today's computers for the most part. What was previously just ideas or just very specialized operations now become more general and exposed to the rest of the world. So mostly I just look at old shit and see what I can rip off without anyone noticing.